Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About It. We are here with co-host Kit Bender in the house.
I'm back.
You're
Look
back.
at me right here.
Yep, you're back. I am very glad, actually, that you're going to be on this episode because in a bit we're going to have a guest on. We're going to talk about consent, and it's typically like a female-focused conversation, I feel like, and I was just like, no, Kit needs to be in this episode. It's important to have a male presence during this conversation.
I think so. I mean, it's a tricky topic because it's it's a thing that is, we would like to think of it as kind of on the extremes.
Yeah.
But it's really not. It's really a part of everyday interactions, whether they're sexual or whether they're not.
Yeah.
But anyone that is just living their life will come across this more than we presently talk about, I think.
Yeah. And we haven't really done an episode talking about sex yet. I mean, we're open to the conversation. We're open to the topic. But it's came up briefly, I think, in past episodes. But something that comes up in our conversations as friends frequently, that's always what we're chatting about. We're always talking about dating and what you're up to. I live vicariously through Kit's dating life.
It's not as exciting as one would think. Trust me.
No, but we get into all the deep little layers of it,
Yeah, it's definitely layered.
Yeah, a lot of layers there. There's a lot of layers in life. And now that I'm back home in Seattle here, been thinking a lot about getting back into routines of things, with traveling that can be a little stressful sometimes, and have been continuing to read Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, fabulous book that Kit recommended a long time ago. And then the universe was just really pushing it at me. We had talked about it, and then I was somewhere else, and then it got brought up there, and then it got brought up somewhere else, and I was like, damn, I need to read this book.
I always pay attention to that. If I hear, even if it's of a podcast or if it's of someone's Instagram or a book or anything like that, if I hear about it from a couple different spots, I'm just like, okay, I get the hint. I should read it.
Okay, universe, fine.
But it's a good book, isn't it? Really
just
profound. An Untethered Soul is what it's called.
Yeah, and I mean, it's honestly taken me a year to read it. I'm not even done yet.
Because
but I keep
it's
going
not
back
long,
and
but
reading
it's dense enough that you get a lot out of it, even on a second or third read.
Yeah.
Even of just certain sections.
I mean, I can honestly read 2 pages, and I'm I'm going to sit on this for the week.
Yeah.
This is also not an ad for this book, but just a really good book. And one thing that I've been doing as I'm reading it is writing down little notes of things that are said in the book that just really hit home, that I'm like I said, I'll read 2 pages and I'm okay, gotta let that sink in. And so I want to start sharing with you guys, whether it's Untethered Soul or whatever other book I'm reading, just kind of little updates on, things that just will take a second to sit in.
Okay.
And so this week, kind of focusing on this thought: awareness does not fight. Awareness releases.
Awareness does not fight. Awareness releases. Okay, what's that doing to your brain? And to your
that when you're aware, you're not fighting it. You're just you're letting it be.
What is it releasing?
I don't know. Releasing, this is some real present time processing, guys. Releasing the fact that you have the awareness, letting the awareness be, releasing the need or the desire to control or to fight the awareness in some way. One thing they always talk about in the book, is you are the observer. Mm-hmm. You are not the feeling that you're feeling. You are the observer that you are feeling. Mm-hmm. And so being aware of that, if you're aware of it, you're not fighting it and trying to make it be all these things. You're releasing that and you're just letting it be. What does release mean for you?
Well, it seems to me okay, you're talking about awareness as in your ability to observe with the most clarity where you are right now. Mm-hmm. maybe both from a place where you zoom out a little bit and you kind of are observing it from a slight distance, just even in your own mind, but also just being aware of the tangible nature of where you are and what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So to me, the release comes when you're aware of two things that you can then let go of. The first is a distraction, a thing that pulls you away from.
That you release the desire to give into the distraction.
You release the desire to give into the distraction, yeah. And then the second would be a trigger or something, which is also a distraction, but it's a very specific distraction because it's one that elicits some kind of often emotion or feeling, an anger or a sadness or an irritation or something like that. That can also, it's a distraction, but I think it's a very specific distraction that has something very important to say. And so I think learning to both sit with those two things and say, what am I being distracted by? And most specifically, what am I being triggered by?
Yeah.
Once we sit with those just long enough, then we can release those things and come back to our awareness.
Now I'm curious because I kind of came up with two things and you kind of came up with two things. And you know how I think that there's a certain part of it that's like, we see those things because those are like our biases, you know? So I'm like, the need to control, you release that. It's like, yeah, that's something I struggle with and work on. And like for you, you're like, oh, distractions and triggers.
Yeah, because those are the things that pull me out. Like I'm not a stressed out person. So it's like, if anything else, I can just zone out into nothingness, getting lost in my brains and daydreaming is an easy thing for me to do.
So I'm curious for other people when they hear awareness does not fight, awareness releases. Yeah. What does that say to you of what you're fighting and that you're trying to release from? Because
there's even that old saying that whatever you fight gets stronger. Like that's just the way it works.
The more you resist, the more it persists.
I was trying to avoid saying that, but you did it. What you resist persists, but that it really is so true. Yeah. And actually releasing whatever that thing is you're resisting, and either sitting with it or just being aware of it, so that you can be more present. I think is an important thing to recognize. But it's different for everybody.
Yeah. And you, just speaking of like being present, you just recently had a date where you were very present in this date. You're very, very intentional, and the outcome was like very different than something you've experienced before. And that, like, I think it's really beautiful, the things that can happen when we're just so present with it. And for that awareness is like releasing the urge to be future focused, to be past focused, to not be present. That when you're being present, you really are releasing all those other things that would be perhaps distracting you from being present. Right. I'm trying to think of I feel like I've been being a lot more present. I was in New York and I was with Derek and I was really focusing on being very present, always intentionally going into our time together. I'm going to be very present and we're going to soak up our time together. But then even, with Lily, I've been practicing being present with Lil because I had to say goodbye to Theo recently, my cats, and, want to make sure that she's doing okay and that she's not, spazzing out or, I don't know, just trying to be very present.
For the first time listeners, Lily is her cat.
Yeah.
This is not like a strange friend that spazzes out random.
And for first-time listeners, welcome to the Crazy Cat Lady podcast, plus Kit. Crazy Cat Man. Crazy Cat Man.
But yeah, cats are easy to almost ignore even once they have their basic needs met. But it can be, it's a different experience to actually interact with them. You can learn from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Lily.
Oh, Theo. Miss you, Theo. There was an episode.
That was a moment of silence for Theo right there.
Yeah, it was a moment of silence for my Theo. But there was an episode that we did a few episodes back on grief and how to thrive through grief and loss. And that episode actually came out the same week that I had to say goodbye to Theo. And it was a really good episode. Really enjoyed our guest on that. So if you guys haven't listened to that one yet, totally recommend checking that one out. But yeah, I think being present, something to always kind of bring your focus back to, and like what your needs are. And I've been working on being very, very present with my body lately, by doing some like exercises, focusing on like my, what I'm putting on my body, what I'm putting in my body, food, skincare, all that kind of stuff. And I've actually been using this new skincare routine with BioClarity. They're a green, gentle skincare line. It just helps me get, that naturally glowy skin. And who doesn't want some nice glowy skin?
I love glowy skin.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought you were pregnant, but apparently it's this. Okay. All right. That's probably...
It's a different kind of glow kit.
Different.
But it's 100% vegan and cruelty-free. And that's really important to me, that I have like good ingredients in the products that I'm using. And one of my favorite things about my experience with BioClarity is actually their ingredients. They have this really unique new ingredient called Floralux, and it's made straight from chlorophyll. I mean, doesn't get much natural than that.
Floralux?
Floralux. Oh. It's a clever form of chlorophyll. It's proven to actually nourish your skin and soothe away imperfections and blemishes. So I've been using it with the Essentials routine, and my nose is always like a little red because I'm like a cold old lady, and my nose is always running because I'm cold. So my nose is always a little bit red. But I've been using the BioClarity routine, and it's actually been helping with some of the redness around my nose. It's kind of like green juice for your face. You can detox and rebalance your skin with BioClarity. It's also delivered straight to you in an easy to use 3-step skincare routine that's 100% vegan, plus gluten and cruelty free. So
you don't want gluten on your face. That's just the worst.
No, you don't want that gluten on your face. There's no need for that to be in there. You guys can also get started on healthier habits with your skincare today. Just go to bioclarity.com. My listeners will get their first month for 50% off of a routine plus free shipping. And it even comes with a 100% risk-free money-back guarantee. So you need to enter my code TAYLOR. That's bioclarity.com and enter my code Taylor.
That's basically robbery, but it's a good deal. So do it.
I love hooking you guys up with those discount codes, but to get back to actually the topic of the day, we're going to talk about consent. Got Kit here with us, so I'm glad we got some male presence in this episode. And the guest actually is a good friend of a good family friend of mine, Rob, who was on the biracial episode, which you guys can also check out. And yeah, she's just been doing amazing work. She has a feminist podcast that promotes healing and normalizes mental health called the Sana Sana Podcast. She's a communications professional and works with this agency called Peer Health Exchange. It's a national nonprofit that works to equip young people with the knowledge, skills, and resources to make healthy decisions. So Adriana is going to come on and share with us some of her knowledge around consent and how we can move forward having these conversations. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here and to talk about this. So I guess first kind of question just kind of started off, we got introduced through Rob, who was on the biracial episode, and you guys have done some work together in the past, and he had actually came up to me and we were, catching up, and he was kind of like, yeah, I was having had lunch or a conversation with my good friend, and we were talking about consent, and she had some really great things to say about it. She's doing all this work around consent, and he was very blown away by the conversation and had taken away such good insight. And so it's kind of how we all got connected here. And I'm curious where all this work around consent started for you.
Sure. Oh, Rob, I love him. I feel like all of our conversations are usually pretty deep, and at some point or another, one of our minds is blown.
Yes. Yes.
So it's good. It's good. It's a reminder that these kinds of conversations don't have to be hard,
mm-hmm.
and they don't always have to necessarily open or have answers, but it's good just to start those conversations, because
mm-hmm.
I think that's where a lot of our answers come from, right?
Yeah.
Just by exploring, and that's what a lot of your podcast does too. So that's one of the reasons I'm a listener.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
No problem. So where did my work with consent start is, I think, the question, right?
Yes.
So that's not necessarily an easy answer, but I basically today I work for an organization called Peer Health Exchange. I'm fairly new there. I started working there, I want to say now like about 6 months ago, and I joined as their senior director of marketing and communications. So basically, I'm like their PR person. I'm usually trying to get other people from our organization to talk to media.
Yeah.
So I'm very much like the hype woman, right? I'm all about hyping up our organization,
Yes.
and really showcasing the talent on that like make up our organization. But I think for me, one of the reasons I was really excited to join Peer Health Exchange is because they are training college students to go into classrooms and have conversations very similar to these with younger folks, so ninth graders particularly in high schools across the country. So we have a health curriculum that we work with, and we talk about big issues like sexual health, mental health, and substances in the classroom. And I think one of the most important things when we're talking about health and safety of young people, really everyone's sexual health when we're thinking about it, right? Understanding and supporting consent is crucial. And I also think it's like the bare minimum. That's like where we should start first and foremost, like really having an understanding of what consent is, what agency is. So that's how I ended up at Peer Health Exchange, because I am someone that I'm a trained journalist. I've been working in advocacy and nonprofit communications for about 9 years now. So I think storytelling, stories, the power of narrative is really important. Like it's a really important tool to be able to open up minds and get people to come together to talk about things that maybe we don't talk about, but we should be. Yeah. So, my work in like marketing and communications has been always on this track of talking about important social issues. So consent for me is just one of those things that I've cared deeply about. And before coming to Peer Health Exchange, I had been doing this work through volunteering at an organization called Mujeres Latinas en Acción. It's a 45-year-old Chicago organization that, amongst many social services that they provide to Latinos and their families, one of them is around sexual assault. So I'm a board member there, and I've been trained. I've gone through their 42-hour sexual assault training, which basically gets you ready to be a medical advocate. You go out to hospitals when someone's been assaulted and they go to the ER room. Yeah. You basically show up and help them navigate their choices, because that sometimes is it's a hard time for you to be clear-headed and thinking through everything that's in front of you. So we basically just provide support in that way. And before that, I think as someone who's been a feminist since as long as I can remember, and someone who's always just gravitated towards like having conversations around all the wonderful and hard things that make us a human being. I've been having conversations around sex and consent for a really long time. Yeah. So I can't tell you where exactly it started, but I think I started doing it a lot more seriously about 4 years ago when I started doing the work with Mujeres.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you make a good point too, that, it's kind of been a part of your life for a long time, as it kind of is for all of us, consent and our sexual health and all of that is something that we deal with on a regular basis, and learning the tools and the skills really to, just kind of be able to navigate that in a healthier way, I think is super important, even though it can be uncomfortable to talk about, especially with the population you're currently working with, ninth graders.
Definitely. And, I think one thing that I always like to talk about when it comes to a lot of these social issues that, thanks to the internet, thanks to all the media at our disposal, like now we have so much more information at our fingertips. Mm-hmm. So I'm always amazed at like the conversations that young folks are having and how woke they are. I don't remember having that like weight behind a lot of my thinking when I was like 14 years old.
Yeah.
But I think what's really great to think about is that, like, no matter how old you are, it's never too late to start learning about these things. Mm-hmm. And even if you think you have an understanding, there's always a deeper layer that needs to be explored. And like, yes. There's just like a lot of like my own understanding has evolved. Mm-hmm. I'm a survivor of sexual assault, so like my own understanding and having language around the things that like I've experienced. Yeah. Continue to evolve. So just mm-hmm. a lot of reasons why we need to continue having all these kinds of talks. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if over the years as you've had these conversations with people, if there's a question or a comment that has continued to come up over and over and over that like you find yourself answering again and again. Are there any like running themes?
There's a lot of them. There's not one. Mm-hmm. But, as you were asking me that question, a scenario popped into my head. I remembered having this conversation with a person, and it wasn't like it started off like we were talking about consent. We were just talking about sex. And he made a little comment to me around, like, what it means to have, like, good or bad sex for him. Mm-hmm. And he made a comment around like, oh, I just hate when someone just like is laying there. We call them starfish.
Yeah, I've heard of them. Of the people call them like dead fish.
Yeah.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And I was like, do you ever think that they're just laying there because they don't want to be there with you?
Great question.
He freaked out. He was like, what?
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, yeah. Do you ever think that like they're not participating
because they're not interested?
They're not interested. They're not comfortable. Like maybe they felt like they had to be there and they don't want to be. And like, mm-hmm. It really blew his mind. And he really challenged, like he got really defensive at first.
Yeah.
And then, I wasn't really trying to make accusations. I was just asking questions. Mm-hmm. So, I was like, that's why I'm really a proponent for enthusiastic consent. Because, like, the only way that, like, is if she's into it, you will know.
Yes.
If she's into it, you will know. And there's plenty of women who love mm-hmm. sex. So if she's just laying there, like, that might be like a good time to stop and like ask some questions.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely.
Like maybe you could ask them like, hey, are you enjoying yourself? Is everything okay?
Mm-hmm.
Learning to read body language can go a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's so much more than that, right? Like right. I think mm-hmm. it's okay to use our words.
Yeah.
But that was like, I just remember that story popping up in my head because I think it really opened his eyes. He was just like, I have never thought about it this way. I'm going to tell all my friends about this.
That's awesome.
Like, yeah, please do. Please do.
He had a little light bulb go off there.
Yep.
That kind of relates to one of the letters that we got. She kind of talks about, she also experienced, this listener had also experienced a sexual assault experience by a group of strangers. She felt like she didn't have a voice, and that she doesn't really post things on social media that are personal, but then felt this strong urge to tell her story. And kind of like how you're saying, you had experienced the sexual assault and you're also like a huge advocate for talking about these kinds of things now. And that was something that really worked for her, was to start telling her story. But something that she thought was kind of a theme around consent. She says, saying no, whether it be a sorry, not tonight, I've got too much to do type of no, or a I said no, stop texting me about it type of no, doesn't translate to convince me. In my experience, the hookup culture we live in today has heightened the expectation of instant gratification for sex and or sex acts. We are inclined to think the person rejecting us is being coy or playing hard to get or teasing us, when most of the time a person saying no in any form means just that. And then when it's finally understood that this person actually means no, the reaction is typically lashing out in some fashion, whether it be verbally, icing the person out, or even physical anger, which leads to many sexual assault crimes. And I gotta say, reading this, I totally felt connected to high school Taylor and college Taylor, because that's so true. That I feel like, for at least in my experience, that saying no or whatever, that's an invitation to convince me. And that then when you do actually say no and that line's drawn, that then people get really upset and real defensive, and then they're just kind of mean to you. Like you hurt the ego of the person doing the pursuing. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And first of all, just a big thank you to that listener that wrote in and shared their story. I think it's really powerful when we tell our stories, and I will be the first to tell you that I wasn't always able to do that. Mm-hmm. I'm 38 years old, and I'm now just starting to own some of my stories.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you're not there yet and you've gone through something like this, it's okay. Mm-hmm. But, if you are able to share your story, I've always filled with gratitude for those people that can and do, mm-hmm. because it's helping us, learn from each other. I think the things that I heard from that letter, there were so many layers to it, right? Mm-hmm. So I'd like to start with just like a little bit of like a definition.
Yes.
Different kinds of like frameworks that I want to couch our conversation around. So mm-hmm. one of the things that I heard from her is talking about hookup culture, right? Mm-hmm. That idea actually is probably as old as time, and it's called rape culture. Mm. Right? Rape culture goes back for as long as we've had a society that's like ruled by what's called a patriarchy, right? Mm-hmm. So like men in power are mostly the people in power. And that can be looked at in a lot of different ways, not just politically. But even when we think about these like gender norms, like what's okay for a guy, what's not okay for a girl, that's all comes back to rape culture, which is a society where we basically are normalizing mm-hmm. sexual violence as accepted.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the norm. Even like this idea of having to convince someone, that is what's called coercion. Mm-hmm. Coercion is basically where you use pressure, or you're like manipulating someone, or, you're persisting, mm-hmm. you're trying to break them down basically to say yes, you're pressuring.
Which isn't even exclusive to a quote-unquote hookup culture. I mean, that happens in relationships. I know very frequently in some of my past relationships where that was like how we ended up having sex, was just this pressure and this constant convincing when you're really just mm-hmm. not feeling it.
Right. Sometimes they trick you. Sometimes they use emotional leverage. Alcohol mm-hmm. or drugs is also part of that coercion.
Yes.
So coercion is a big part of like whether that makes something consensual or not. Mm-hmm. So even if you said yes after you've said no a million times, that's not really a yes.
Yeah.
So I just want to put a little asterisk by that. So there was coercion that I heard in her letter. Mm-hmm. And then also just like this idea of what we're talking about when we talk about consent. So there's a lot of different definitions. There's legal definitions, which mm-hmm. I rarely abide by those unless I'm like helping someone with like a day in court.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I try to live by ethical definitions. Mm-hmm. And so for me, consent isn't just about like a yes or no. It's what I kind of referenced earlier, this idea of enthusiastic consent. Mm-hmm. And that is where the people who are involved in this moment or this encounter, everybody's all in and there is no question. Like, you are excited about it. At Peer Health Exchange, we define it as, hold on, let me see. I just want to make sure at Peer Health Exchange, we define it as choosing freely to do something, a clear yes at every step of sexual activity. So for me, I always add just like that it's between, consenting adults, that it's, sober. That's, I take it to the next level in terms of like being really clear what enthusiastic consent means to me.
Yeah.
And so like we all probably have our own definition of consent.
Which is why it's also important to communicate that.
Definitely. And as a society, like, I would love for us to move past rape culture into consent culture, where we basically feel really comfortable talking about it, that we're not embarrassed or it's not weird to talk about consent, that, you are taking into mind the other person's pleasure and it's not just about your own pleasure. So that to me is consent culture. Where we celebrate that and it's exciting and it's not weird and you're bringing mindfulness to your interactions with other people.
Yeah.
Which, like you said, can be done outside of the bedroom, right? Like if you're bullying someone into doing something, whether it's inside of the bedroom or not, like that's like not okay, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think too that, kind of what the listener brings up is this kind of like perpetual state, the cycle that we see, or at least that I've experienced, that part of why it becomes so uncomfortable to talk about and at times uncomfortable to say no is because there is that sense that I think most women are aware of, with if you do say no, if you are resisting that you will be met with some kind of punishment, some kind of a backlash. I know I've had guys that, like, when I make it clear that that's not the type of relationship I'm interested in, or for that night, that's not something that I care to engage in, that then I'm name called. I would be bullied at school. I would be, kind of like ostracized as like, she didn't give it up. So, she can't like hang with us, whatever kind of thing. And I mean, I think that even in relationships, even in romantic relationships, that at times there can be this fear around saying no because of how that other person will react in terms of power, in terms of how they utilize their power, how they express their power over your decision in a way to kind of punish you for that answer, which then at times, kind of is part of that convincing of like, okay, well, I should do this because then, I don't want to be name called and I don't want to like, be put down. And
yeah, well, what it feels like is it feels like a part of the game that went too far. Because I think built into just the way that we interact socially is a little bit of a dance and a little bit of a game with the push and the pull of just the way we communicate verbally and non-verbally, and then the way we flirt, and the way that all these things are kind of pushed back and forth as people are figuring each other out.
Yeah.
And I think that's a natural thing, but I think there does come a point where the game becomes less about finding that beautiful place in the middle where two people can meet. Yeah.
And it becomes more of a game where one person's
more of a
winning.
competition. Yeah. Because there's two ways to game. You can play a game that's more like a dance, or you can play a game that's more like like a zero sum, where there has to be a winner and when one person has to feel like they have to win, right? And then built into that is on someone that loses on the other end. But that's tricky. Do you have any advice for people that are learning how to to play that game and to have that dance with people, but which does require sometimes a push. It does require some pushes of confidence and of asserting yourself a little bit in order to make yourself known. But then sometimes that does mean maybe for some people within their own head even that means they're coming up on that line of is this okay?
Well, one thing that I just wanted, before I forget to mention when we were talking about the listener letter, the reaction of someone who's receiving the no, how that that ends up. So we're talking a lot about guy-girl dynamics, but understand that like this happens within queer relationships too.
Yeah.
And that's not like anyone who's having sex can experience this. But when we talk about like the harsh or violent reactions, I mean, that is being fueled by, you know, men are more often the ones that are violating or becoming violent in terms of just the numbers when we get the rejection,
or at least the reported numbers. Yeah.
Right. And so when we talk about like why people might not even say no is because of that fear too. That's a real fear. Some people lose their lives over this.
Yeah.
Right. Like we hear stories every day about women who get killed just for not giving someone their phone number or, you know, like that's a real thing. But I think, you know, in terms of the advice piece, I think part of it is really challenging ourselves to start thinking differently about sex. You know, and I think that's what makes, what's making a lot of people uncomfortable and like even scared, you know, like I think a lot of people are fearful of like what these conversations around consent mean because there are a lot of people that aren't ready to let that power go.
There's
you know, I'm sorry, go ahead, Taylor.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a lot that is required for us to change, like how we feel, right? So again, if we're talking about everybody is excited to have sex in this moment, that is a lot different than like the dance or the game where like one of us is going to win.
Right.
And one of us is going to lose. You know, I think the whole like giving in, even that concept of giving in or submitting, like if we get rid of that dynamic and we're like, no, everybody showing up to the party is excited and like blowing their little party streamers and
they got their gifts wrapped.
Yeah, everybody's like really happy to be here to sing happy birthday. That's a totally different, you know,
and then
dynamic.
You wouldn't be complaining about having sex with a dead fish because she wouldn't have been convinced.
Exactly.
And this reminds me, there's a comedian, and I can't remember who it is. It might have been Aziz. I don't know. I can't remember, but they talk about, actually it might have been Louis. I don't know. But there was a comedian that talked about, you know, how we talk about dating and like sexual activity in terms of like bases, like a baseball game, and how twisted that is, and how we should really be looking at it as like we're ordering pizza together. Because when you start ordering pizza together, you're like, oh, well, what kind of pizza do you want? Like, do you like this on your pizza? Do you like this topping? You know, it's a conversation that you have, and then you're both enjoying it, as opposed to bases where it's like, yeah, you're just trying to run to the next base as fast as possible and trying to like make sure the other person doesn't catch the ball and all this stuff. And that with baseball, it's like you're on opposite teams, you know, but if you're just ordering pizza together, you know, you have this whole conversation, and then who doesn't like pizza? Like everyone's just, you get to enjoy it, you know? And I thought that was
vegans don't like pizza, Taylor.
There's vegan pizza. But I thought that was such a cool, like, different way of looking at it, where it's like, you know, this conversation that you're both having. You both have things on there that you like. You know, maybe you get a, you know, half and half kind of pizza where, like, you're both compromising on getting some of the things that you guys both like. And I don't know. I thought it was just a cool, different way to look at it.
Definitely. Because I think it goes back to that idea that, like, you do care if the other person is going to enjoy their slice of pizza.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
exactly.
It's no longer just about your pleasure, but about your shared pleasure and about your partner's pleasure.
And I'd imagine that the process that these two people go through as they're ordering the pizza can be as fun as actually eating the pizza, and actually the reward of actually getting it is kind of the fruit of what was maybe a really great interaction. So like the foreplay and the things leading up, the things that are affirming in every step of the way, instead of just the final act. Like it can all be enjoyed.
Exactly. And then even before the picking up, the foreplay, it's like asking, hey, do you want to get pizza?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
It doesn't really matter if she was really into Thai food, you know?
Right. Or like, I'm going to get some pizza. Do you want
some?
Do you want to get in on this?
Yeah.
There's a million different ways to ask, but yes.
Yes. And one thing I want to ask you, we got this other letter, and I think this kind of goes back to talking about like the legal definition of consent versus some ethical definitions of consent. When we talk about drinking and body language, and we kind of, I'm not sure if you watched Paradise, but this last season of Paradise that I was on, there was this whole scandal with this incident where consent really became a topic on the show. And, we were kind of taught these legal definitions of consent. And I kind of had some differing ones, given that I'm someone that doesn't drink. But we did get a letter from someone, and she asked, she says, is inebriated consent still consent? I know the concept of consent is so difficult for some people to grasp. I obviously agree that it must always be given, but I don't think it necessarily always needs to be given verbally. What I mean by that is that consent can be given and just as easily taken away through the use of body language. The same way you can tell if someone is uncomfortable in an awkward situation, you should be able to tell if a woman or man aren't comfortable with your advances. Quite frankly, sometimes the absence of sound or verbal communication is a greater indicator than a simple yes. And she goes on to say you can agree or disagree, but on that, this is the root of my question. Does the consent of someone drunk enough to be taken advantage of count as consent? I wager you'll say no, this doesn't count. However, my counter question is, how about when the consent is given by an inebriated person within a loving relationship?
Oh, there's like a couple.
There's a lot of layers.
There's a few things in there.
Oh yeah, yeah. Where should we start?
Yeah.
Well,
let's start with the general question of
is inebriated consent?
Yeah, drugs and alcohol as part of that process.
I always am. You remember when you asked me kind of like, I have questions that come up a lot. This is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
I think people want to figure out how can we still have drunk sex.
Yes, yeah. I mean, a huge part of it is like I need a few more drinks before I approach this person to then maybe because I want to have sex with them.
Well, and some of it is we just humans just have a tendency to get in their heads, especially around things like sex, and sometimes a little bit of taking the edge off helps us engage in a different way. But then there's that like always this cliff where
and it's like, are you really mindfully engaging?
Then are you mindfully? Yeah, it becomes gray really quickly.
Very quickly. And I think even for myself, this is a definition that has really changed for me, myself. Personally, like I am a sober person, so like that really just helps a lot. But like I didn't used to be. And I think my understanding of like what was at stake has really changed too. So like, in my definition of enthusiastic consent, that includes both people being sober. But I think the question is really asking about a loving relationship. And I think within a loving relationship, there should be, quote unquote, be, already a lot of communication at play. And if it's not, that sometimes is a root of like a deeper issue. The thing with me, once you throw alcohol in the mix or any other kind of drug or something that puts you under the influence, if you change your mind, which you're allowed to do at any point in time, like I think it just makes it a lot harder to have that conversation, even within a loving relationship. Even within a loving relationship, you're not obligated to go through with something that you said you would earlier. And then we're talking about levels of intoxication too, right?
Yes.
So that's where, again, we're talking about the very gray areas. How can you tell if someone is tipsy versus, I mean, you should be able to tell someone's blacked out because they're laying there and not conscious,
But everyone responds differently. Everyone reacts differently.
Totally.
And I think part of it depends also on what kind of sex it is you're wanting to have. Like for me as a sober person, you know, I date people that drink, and I've never had sex with someone who's been drunk, because for me, I feel like they can't actually give that consent. I feel like they're not present how I want them to be. And it doesn't feel like the kind of quality connection that I want to have in the sex that I have, because then that becomes less enjoyable for me. And I don't want to have unenjoyable sex.
Right. Well, one of the volunteers I worked with just last week she did a wonderful job. Her name is Kirsty. She's out of the Bay Area. Shout out to Kirsty. She was explaining, like, again, if we're talking about our pleasure, you know, often while alcohol may lower your inhibitions, it also lowers your sensitivity. So, like, you are not feeling, you know, sex the same way you would if you were sober. So she was less concerned about, like, let's talking about right or wrong in the moment, but like also if we're talking about enthusiastically participating, can you really do that if you're missing some of your senses?
Yeah.
But for me, no, it's not consensual in a loving relationship or not. But if we're talking about, again, like larger definitions, it's important to really start to have those questions with your partner, especially if it's within, you know, a relationship.
Like 2 drinks might be one thing, but, you know, having, you know, if you're having the, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? The like typical amount that you should be drinking part of like 1 drink per hour kind of a thing. Right. That might be a different conversation for you and your partner to have, versus if you're out taking shots at the club and then want to go back and have sex, that might be a different thing.
It's almost like we all need to just, for ourselves, write down what our definition of enthusiastic consent is. Like what our criteria is of
and what kind of sex you want to be having.
Yeah, when we feel enthusiastic about.
Yeah, and she also, you know, she brings up body language in this letter, and I think that can only go so far, because also, like we talked about earlier, where sometimes that body language is a part of that dance of, like, you know, do you like when I move towards you this way? No, okay, what if I move this way? Like figuring out what the other person likes and whatnot, but that, you know, that sometimes there is this like, oh, I'm gonna like tease you a little bit, and like there's blurred lines there to where I don't think enthusiastically that could be you know, firm consent.
No, you know, honestly, the thing about that is that if it was that easy, right, we wouldn't have people using body language as like a reason to rape. They're like, no, she totally wanted it.
Yeah,
she was pressing into me. My friend Jessie, she's a sister of mine in this type of work. She works at Planned Parenthood, and she was explaining to me like that she did this workshop once where it was on victim blaming. They were talking about like how someone dresses.
Yes, and I was going to get to that. I'm glad you're talking about this.
Yeah, she was like, okay, I want you to draw a woman with a skirt that you would consider slutty, like. And then when everybody showed their picture, like the lengths of the skirt were so different. And I think that really is telling, like, your interpretation of body language, whether it might be clear to you or not, I think is completely different than the person next to you. And it leaves way too much room for a gray area to know, like, that consent is implied. Like, again, if you're not 100% absolutely sure, like, why would it be a big deal just to be like, hey, how you doing? Are you still having fun? Like, is this still a good thing? Like, how does this feel? You know, there's a lot of different ways to get that verbal consent. And I think that really, like, helps to relieve a lot of ambiguity. Like, just like having those questions or asking.
There was a time when if a girl showed too much ankle, it was too much. So,
yeah.
Right.
Cultures have taken these giant swings, and so who knows?
Yeah. Totally. And kissing is not necessarily consent for sex, or kissing is not necessarily, you know, like the next step to something. And, you know, body language, there's like a huge spectrum on that. That doesn't mean that if I'm holding your hand that I'm ready for the next thing.
Yeah. And I think, like, for me, I want to really make it clear, like, I remember even, you know, I mean, I guess still sometimes today where, you know, if I really want to like get really dressed up and like, yeah, that might be a little bit more skin showing, but like not to shame myself in that, to feel like other people are going to look at me thinking, you know, that I'm asking for it, or that, you know, oh, I'm like looking like such a hoe. And, you know, sometimes that's like a thing that I think women can embrace. And I mean, probably isn't the best thing for like my psyche, but you know, if I'm getting ready, I'm like, yep, I'm getting hoed up, like getting ready to go out, and you know, I'm excited for it. I'm going to feel good. And it's just like, it's a way to kind of own that, I guess. And like,
and it can be like just an expression of your own feminine energy in like a really,
yeah. And I mean, I think
doesn't
like
have to be a slutty.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be in like a negative way either, I think. But for me, I mean, I want it to be very clear for people listening that like, no matter what you wear, no matter how you choose to express yourself, with your clothing, with your accessories, with your makeup, how you style your hair, that doesn't give anyone the consent or the right to touch you in any way that you don't consent to. And that I think that's super important as like a takeaway for this, because I know there are a lot of women that listen, and that like to not shame yourself for how you're choosing to express yourself, because no matter what, that doesn't mean that you asked for it, and that doesn't mean that you deserve to be treated in any kind of disrespectful way.
No, yeah, I'm so glad that you said that. Definitely not. And I mean, that's also kind of goes back to rape culture, right? Like we are just prone as a society to sexualize the naked body.
Yeah.
You know, so you could be walking down the street naked. You could be sleeping next to someone naked. That does not give you the permission to touch them if they have not given you that consent or permission. So I think that just goes back to this idea that like, you know, women's bodies specifically, I think get very sexualized when it's just a body, you know, like this is how we came into the world. If you're naked, you know, like, society is the one that has really put all of these like connotations to what like an exposed ankle means.
Yeah.
I love that kid. Ankles are totally sexy, so I get it.
I show mine all the time.
But yeah, how we dress and how we like express ourselves, I think can be a really powerful message. You know, I love to experiment with different ways of dressing. ModCloth is actually one of my favorite brands because it's a company that's designed by women for women, and they have a variety of looks. They come in full size ranges from extra small to 4X, so they're really welcoming of all body shapes and all sizes of women. Another one of the things I love about ModCloth is they have a great, like somewhat off topic but totally on topic for our pod, is they have a great selection of like cat themed clothing. So I got this.
Should have known that's where it was going.
It's a part of our conversation. Cats are always relevant. So they have just an amazing, like they have like cute, quirky items. You know, you can show a little bit of that ankle. And I got this little robe and it says meow all over it and has little cat faces on it. And I always get the cutest little compliments on it when friends come over and I'm wearing it because it's so like fluffy and just adorable.
First of all, why are you wearing a robe when you have friends over?
Because like I said earlier, I'm always like a cold old lady. And so, I mean, I'll still have regular clothes on, but I'll put my little robe on over top of it.
Got some Kleenex stuffed in the little pocket.
Yeah.
Little cup of tea.
Yeah, I mean, ModCloth just honestly lets me express myself in the most authentic way possible. Every purchase I get from them, I'm in love with, and I always get amazing compliments on. Whether it's cute athletic leggings that I get or really adorable overalls, I'm always super happy with my ModCloth purchases. And you guys can actually get 15% off your purchase of $100 or more, which is very easy to do. You don't even realize you're just shopping through, and then all of a sudden you have $100 in your cart. But I'm going to help you, ladies. We're going to get that 15% off your purchase. Go to modcloth.com, modcloth.com, and enter code Taylor at checkout. But hurry, because this offer expires on June 29, 2018. Again, go to modcloth.com and enter code Taylor for 15% off your purchase of $100 or more. Thinking about it now, our discussion of the first letter actually really hinted at like the Me Too movement with the use of pressure and power and like coercion for consent. And I'm curious how you've seen, this Me Too movement impact the work that you've been doing with peer exchange, if at all.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question.
Or maybe just your conversations in general around consent, how this movement is.
How it's been influencing.
Well, it seemed to have given people a voice that felt like they maybe previously didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of what we're seeing is still rippling throughout. At Peer Health Exchange, because we've been talking about consent for a long time now. Like, this has been a part of our curriculum since before Me Too erupted. Mm-hmm. I think what it's really done is just emphasize how important our work is in terms of really teaching consent. And like, the younger you can start teaching this, the better.
Yeah.
We focus on high school students and we teach in 9th grade classrooms. So it's like, in the ideal world, it would be great if a young person, by the time they get to the 9th grade classroom where they're learning our curriculum, it's like a refresher, right? Like they've actually already been taught that they have agency over their own bodies and like can say yes or no to what's happening to them. Unfortunately, that is not always the reality. And for many young people, this is the first time that they're hearing these concepts and they're hearing what consent is and what it is. So I think what Me Too has done is really just made it so clear how important it is to be having these conversations regularly. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really proud about the work that we do. Because, when you're having these conversations with your peers, which that's what our model does, it's like near peer with college students talking to high school students. And so like the age gap is not that big. It's a lot different than like talking to your teachers about it. Like these are college, young folks that these issues are just as important to them as it is to the 9th graders that they're teaching.
Yeah.
Too, right? So they're just having like really open, frank conversations. It's like complete real talk. And that's what I love about it. I've had a chance to like sit in a lot of those classrooms. I'm an observer and I'm learning from them as much as they're probably learning from each other. And then beyond Peer Health Exchange, I think I've just noticed that people are more open to having these conversations like never before. I think a lot of people that I feel like may have never even wanted to talk about these things are talking about it because we're being forced to, right? We're really being put in a place where we're finally paying attention and like listening to women mostly. I think women have been saying these things for a really long time.
Yeah. And I think it's also kind of given some men the courage to also stand up. We've seen that as well with the Me Too movement of some men also standing up and sharing their stories. And I think it's, you bring up a really good point that like these are conversations that I think women have been having for a long time, but perhaps that like men really haven't. And I think, with everything happening with the Me Too movement, that it's almost kind of creating debates around what consent is and how that, and, I think I've heard some things along the lines that are kind of hard to hear, like, well, what did she expect was going to happen? Or like, well, that's what she gets, and then she gets to do all these other great things. So why is she complaining and stuff like that? But even though those things are hard to hear, I think it's good that people can express those so we can actually have a conversation about like what that actually is.
Well, I think even beyond the topic of consent, I think it's really, really cool what especially your organization is doing in even just bringing sexuality onto the table and giving people a voice. Because, you and I are similar ages, and I know growing up it was, the less it was talked about, the better. As far as like in the family and in the school, it was just like the more you could keep it out of conversation, then the better it was seemed. But then we never like learned how to have these conversations. It was always this haze of taboo.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like what I was talking about earlier, like how young people really have this language that I didn't have at that age, right? I think that's speaking exactly to what you're saying, Kit. Like, just because we're not talking about it doesn't mean that these things aren't going to happen. What is happening when we don't have the conversation is that, like, you're failing to equip people with the skills that they need to make decisions for themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where it gets pretty scary, and why I'm a big proponent of, like, let's talk about it.
There we go. Ding, ding,
right?
ding.
Let's talk about it.
Let's
but
talk about it.
I think it makes some people really uncomfortable, but I think you're right in that it doesn't make, the kids as uncomfortable as it does sometimes. I think the older generations that are like, wait, why are we being so frank about this? We're not used to talking about this, and it can be overwhelming to them. But it's because there's a way to, I think, talk about sexuality without just being crude and without just being risque. And I think that's when those have for a long time been just lumped up in one big box. Sometimes we got to take them and say we can talk about these in two different ways.
Yeah, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. That's where growth happens. Right? Like, I don't think comfort should be our like what we're reaching for.
Which is where I think we have a lot to learn from organizations like yours and from kids that are saying, we don't understand it all, and we're not trying to have the answers, but we're trying to, sometimes it is a bit of shooting for aiming for a moving target, but still, like, the point is you're aiming. The point is that the conversation is happening. And I think so as in those that anyone that gets uncomfortable by it has a lot to learn from those that are currently doing a good job of being open.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of things that are uncomfortable, just talking about sex in and of itself is uncomfortable. Then going on to talk about sexual assault can be uncomfortable. Talking about rape can be uncomfortable. Talking about consent, but like all of these things are, things that we really should just open the doors for, because they are sex is such a natural part of who we are as humans. And, earlier you mentioned experiencing a sexual assault experience yourself. And I'm curious what, if that was before kind of doing some of this work, or if that was more recent, and like how that kind of, what that experience taught you about consent and how you kind of look at perhaps the dynamics of, our sexual interactions differently from that experience.
Mm-hmm. There's this consent advocate. Her name is Amour. I recommend people who are on Instagram to look her up. She's really amazing.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I bring her up is because I was reading this essay that she wrote on Huffington Post about how she has survived assault many different times. And it dawned on me that I'm like, oh, so have I. And I think it's because, again, my idea of what consent was evolving at the time. And so, if I'm using my own definition of enthusiastic consent where coercion was not involved, then I've had a lot of incidents, and most of those incidents have been with someone that I was dating or a significant other, where, I was coerced into doing something I didn't want to do, or even I said no, and then it didn't really matter.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think part of those experiences, the most recent one was probably around 2 years ago.
So you were already pretty involved in this work.
Yes, I was already very involved. And I think it's important to talk about that because the more that you do know and are able to advocate for yourself, the easier it will be to really own your agency and really be in your body and be able to know what is right and wrong for you. But even then, we have to talk about how there are other external factors that are stacked up against us.
Yeah.
And that's where, understanding rape culture, understanding coercion really is important. Understanding power dynamics, all of that is really, really important. And then also understanding that, sometimes when we're in those situations, our bodies react in ways that we did not expect. So, as an example, freezing is one of those things. Like, we live in a world where we tend to blame the victim. That's part of rape culture. But we're actually, as a society, we're hardwired to blame the victim. There's like this like really interesting theory that says that like when something happens to someone, it doesn't really live up to our expectation that the world is a fair and just place. So we want to focus on how the person that is the victim, like they did something wrong. Because if they did something wrong, then that still means we live in a good, just
That's
world.
something bad happened to you because you did something bad.
Exactly.
And that is so prevalent in this culture around dating and hooking up. That's exactly it.
But that's even such an ancient idea. Like even there was I don't know. I like weird psychology or philosophy and theology stuff. But there was a time where there was like a blind person that they brought to Jesus, and they were like, "Who sinned, him or his parents?" They're like, where do we place the blame for this? They were wrestling with that kind of victim blaming all the way.
Yeah,
it's just a human thing.
Even back then, right?
Yeah.
So knowing that like we don't live in a just world, that good things do happen to bad people. Like if we can learn to like recognize when we're victim blaming, like the sooner we could do that, the better we can gain empathy and compassion and really start to look at what is the problem then.
Yeah.
So for me, I was in the middle of this work when something like that happened to me. And I realized like there were other things that were contributing to my finding myself in those situations. Not that, again, I wasn't victim blaming myself, but I was able to start to see like what was taking agency away from me. One of those big things was alcohol. So for me, like I realized like I had a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol. So about 2 years ago, I decided to remove it altogether. And it's been a really like eye-opening experience to like understand how it played a role in a lot of decisions that put me in harm's way, but that does not take away it doesn't take away what those people like who were harming me. It doesn't take away their blame or fault in what they did. It just helped me be more aware of like what was happening or in my own surroundings. And just like the kind of people that I was choosing to engage with or have relationships with, like it's been like a 180.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been pretty eye-opening.
Yeah. I mean, those are good like takeaways to reflect on about yourself and your life in a way that's not blaming or shaming yourself from that experience.
No. And again, just to reiterate, it does not matter. Like if you are drinking, if you are assaulted, that is not your fault.
Yeah. I'm curious what kind of takeaways or, points of encouragement that you could give for both men and for women moving forward with both giving and receiving consent, how they can, have the courage to give their consent, and also how we can, on both sides of gender, better receive someone else's consent.
Yeah, all sides of gender, right? Because we have genders, not a non-binary.
Yes.
Concept,
gender fluid, whatever you are.
Yeah.
Yes.
So all people, I think, can benefit from just, I loved what Kit was saying, to really like sit with yourself and have like a little journal setting time around like, what is consent to me? How do I feel about consent? But beyond that, really, I think if we could start to practice consent outside of the bedroom, like really listening to each other. When you're asking someone to do something, really taking their yes or no like heart and in first moment. So like I've been really trying to practice that at work, with friends. Like if I ask a favor of you and you say no, I'm gonna like immediately thank you for considering it and leaving it at that.
That's
right? Not trying to convince.
That's such a good point. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reflecting on being an only child and having only child syndrome. And yeah, I don't take no very well. And I'm like, wait, but how can I get my way? So that's a really good point to think about. I mean, even the Gottmans, lead researchers in couples therapy, they say everything in your relationship is foreplay. Everything that happens outside of the bedroom is foreplay. And so to think about, just accepting someone's answer as their answer and not trying to push through that to get your way, that's a great way to practice that.
Yeah, just really listening, right? Being sensitive and thinking that everybody in your life deserves dignity and respect. What a radical idea, right? So whether that's a child in your life, or an elder, someone, whoever you're having a conversation with, whoever you're engaging with around a decision, like really taking those decisions to heart when they tell you like, no, or I'm not, even if it's like, I'm not sure, like giving that person space to figure it out without like pressuring them. I think that's like a really big mindset for a lot of us. I know it is for me, and it's an ongoing act of learning. We're never going to stop, because I think we've learned all of these concepts. We live in a rape culture that is like, we all are complicit in some way, shape, or form, until we decide to actively work against that, until we decide to unlearn everything we've learned growing up, which all of that was not our fault. But I think at the moment of awakening where we're like, oh, I never looked at it that way. Oh, I totally see that actually happening in my life.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, like I've blamed people before for like getting robbed, once we start to have those realizations, especially as we're adults, like it is on us to start to like learn as much as we can and really be there for the people who as we know in our society, there's intersections of like marginalized people, like that there's more things stacked up against them being able to have full free agency. So like, how can we be there for them? So that's my advice. Just like listen to each other, have a lot of conversations with each other, explore and reflect. And then if you have questions, like reach out and talk with other people who have been doing this work.
Yeah.
We might not have the answers, but I can definitely be considered a resource. I work with a lot of amazing people and a lot of amazing organizations that I'm happy to put people in touch with.
Yeah. And so if people do want to reach out to you, how can they find you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Adriana, and that's ADRIANA, the number 9, and my last name, D as in David, IAZ. That's the best way to find me on social media. But you can also send me an email, which I will share in the links.
Yes. Yeah, so all of the contact information will be listed in the episode notes description, so you guys should 100% check that out for all the other ways that you guys can get in touch and like explore, the organization, Peer Health Exchange, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm totally here, willing to listen, and happy to put you in touch with folks that are doing great work if you're interested in volunteering or giving money or any of the ways that you can support organizations that are doing this work, like Peer Health Exchange and Mujeres Latinas en Acción.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing some of your knowledge around consent with us and having this important conversation around sex and consent, not something that gets talked about enough, and really, really appreciate you coming on and being vulnerable and sharing parts of your story and just helping educate people more about this. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for hosting and having this platform. It's such a pleasure to chat with both you and Kit.
Yeah, it was great talking with you. And that's a wrap.
That's a wrap, guys. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Let's Talk About It. We love hearing feedback from you guys, so leave us a review on iTunes and let us know what you're liking about the show.
And do your homework and write your own personal definition of enthusiastic consent. and how that applies to you.
Yeah, we want to hear what enthusiastic consent means to you. If you have topics that you want us to discuss or questions for us about certain topics, you can send those to us in an email at ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And you can find us on Instagram at letstalkaboutit_podcast. Thanks so much. See you.
Let's talk about it. Bye. Let's stop talking about it.
Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next time.
This podcast is brought to you by Wave Podcast Network. Check out all of our shows, including the Brain Candy Podcast, I Don't Get It, Babes and Babies, Coffee Convos, and Let's Talk About It.